Hello, and welcome to Breast Cancer Conversations, a podcast brought to you by survivingbreastcancer.org. I'm Laura Carfing, breast cancer survivor and founder of survivingbreastcancer.org, a nonprofit organization providing community, education, and resources to empower those diagnosed with breast cancer and their caregivers from day one and beyond. Hello, my friends. How are you guys doing today? Seriously, how are you doing? There is a new feature for us to strengthen our relationship as a breast cancer community. So if you like this podcast episode or just want to get in touch, of course, you can always email me at laura@survivingbreastcancer.org. But at the studio here, we have a new feature where you can send us fan mail. So down below, there is a hyperlink that I think it says love this episode, send us a text. And you can actually send us a message. Your identity is completely preserved. We don't know who you are outside of your location. I believe that's what gets captured, but we don't have your phone number or your email or even your name. But if you want to send us fan mail and let us know about how we're doing on the podcast, if there's ever any topics you want to hear, or if you have questions for either myself or our guest, send us some fan mail. We would love to hear from you, and you will get a shout out on the next episode. Additionally, if you're new to Breast Cancer Conversations, I'd love to welcome you and want to remind you that our podcast episode is brought to you by our nonprofit, survivingbreastcancer.org. If you're looking for additional support resources, we offer almost 400 programs a year to support all of us going through a breast cancer diagnosis, whether you are living with an early stage diagnosis or living with metastatic breast cancer. There's something out there for all of us. We have weekly support groups. We have expressive writing classes. We have art expression classes. We have yoga, qigong, meditation, so many great resources to support you as the whole person. Let your medical care team take care of the treatment, and we got everything else on your survivorship plan. Today, I am so excited to have Stephanie S. Abbott on the podcast. Stephanie is a cancer survivor, a former healthcare executive, and author of Buried or Planted, 100 plus expert insights from a healthcare executive's journey as a cancer patient. Stephanie has served in multiple leadership roles, including Chief Experience Officer for Adventist Health, Division Vice President of Patient Experience for HCA, and Corporate Assistant Director of Patient Experience for Intermountain Health. Stephanie has spearheaded the design of patient and caregiver experiences, emphasizing culture, process enhancements, and patient safety. Her individual mission is to inspire teams to deliver care that is safe, dignified, and dependable within an environment that fosters compassion, trust, and collaboration.
When I asked one question and I said, am I going to make it to next Christmas? And he said, I don't know. From then on, I heard nothing. It was a tornado and I was just spinning.
Welcome to the conversation. Hello, my friends. I am so excited to have you tune in to another episode of Breast Cancer Conversations. I am joined with Stephanie Abbott, who is joining us today from Tampa, Florida, and has a plethora of experiences and advice and resources that we're going to dive into today about strengthening the conversation and understanding what it is, not just from the patient perspective, but also from the nurse perspective of going through a cancer diagnosis. I think you hear a lot on our podcast, the patient perspective, and when you hear the words that you've been diagnosed with breast cancer, how overwhelming that can be. And we hear the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? Some of us gel right away with our medical professionals the moment we meet our oncologist, the moment we meet our surgeon or plastic surgeon. And sometimes, it could be like, wow, I met this person and he didn't see me. He didn't hear me. He didn't take, I'm using he, it could be a woman, it could be anyone, they, all of the pronouns, but the surgeon didn't necessarily understand my concerns or didn't resonate with what questions I had or what was important to me. And so how do we strengthen those communications with our care team? And then also, I would love, and I think Stephanie's here to also share light on what's going through the mind of our providers, our doctors, our nurses. Are we the first patient they're seeing that day? Are we their 4:30 appointment after a really tough day of having learned that they might have lost someone to metastatic breast cancer? We are all human at the end of the day. So how can we strengthen those relationships and those dialogues and skills? So huge topics. I know I just threw a lot out there, but Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us today. If you would like to introduce yourself and a little bit about your professional background.
So my name is Stephanie and I go by Stephanie S. Abbott. So there's no confusion. I know there's some other people out there with very similar names. I got diagnosed on November 12th, 2021. And as a mom, I feared for really what that meant for my children. As a healthcare executive now with 15 years experience being in, the facility level all the way to the corporate level, moving from a C-suite chair to a chemotherapy chair gave me an entirely new perspective about healthcare. And so after my diagnosis, I really decided to document everything about how processes were interrupted by different things, the friction I experienced as a patient, and ultimately how things made me feel. As a healthcare executive, I understand why we do what we do in operations for the most part, not the professional and everything, right? But now here's how it felt as a patient. And unfortunately, we have these amazing people that dedicate their lives to healthcare. And sometimes the patients don't feel that love and that compassion and, that dedication, unfortunately, because of the way that the environment is designed.
That's such a good insight to kind of think through, like, here's the operations, here's the practice. On paper, this looks good. On the bottom line, this looks good. On, all of the things that executives take into consideration when running the operations, the hospitals and the systems. But what does that look like in practice? And that's what I'm hearing you say a little bit. Like, so what is the patient experience in relation to these protocols that the hospital puts forth? If you don't mind me asking, were you treated at the same place where you work?
No. So that's part of the interesting thing. So I actually started at a hospital outside of my system in one different system. And that's where I started seeing the OB/GYN person, and she noticed that something was wrong, right? So then she sent me for your basic mammogram and a biopsy. And I did that within my system, but I was still brand sparkling new as I became the chief experience officer for an organization, and I was still brand new, so nobody knew who I was. So I was able to have those first few visits with, again, being like a shadow, like nobody, getting the treatment that you would expect, right? Nobody knew my chair. And then I ended up moving out of my system for different reasons and going to a different system that my insurance would support. And I made sure that nobody knew who I was. And I went through the system just like anybody would. And, people are like, well, why did you do that? Healthcare is supposed to be that area where, you don't, everybody's supposed to get the same care. And it's like, well, everybody does get the same care. However, if you have a friend that owns a restaurant and you come in for dinner, your service is just going to be a little bit better, right?
Yes, you can
It's
skip
the
the
same.
lines on that Saturday night.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly. It's the same thing in healthcare. And I know I'm going to get heat for this saying this, and somebody's going to be in my inbox with a nasty gram. If you don't have to call ahead at your hospital or your clinic and, nobody's a VIP,
Mm.
I'd love to know where you work, because out of all the places that I have worked with, talked to, all that fun stuff, I haven't found any one of those.
In preparation for this podcast, we reached out to a number of our community members to ask, how is your communication with your doctors, with your nurses, et cetera? And what you're reminding me, one person mentioned when she was going through radiation, which is a Monday through Friday, 30 days that she went through every single day,
Mhm.
she was always greeted by the receptionist. Hello, gorgeous. Good morning, gorgeous. Nice to see you again. And just that like welcome and that hello and that acknowledgement, right? And so, again, some people might just not even say, "Yep, thank you, you're checked in, go sit over there." But to get that
Mhm.
hello and that greeting makes so much of a difference. And so again, I'm bringing that up just in terms of like you could be like the CEO or you could just be the patient, but when you're in that Johnny, we're all kind of level. And, just that hello and that acknowledgement is really nice, not because of your title, but because of you're just going through something really difficult. Hey, my friend, sorry to interrupt the flow of this amazing podcast, but because it's Breast Cancer Awareness Month, I wanted to let you know about our Tell Cancer to Go Take a Hike event. I'm reaching out to you to ask for your support to help us raise these critical funds that we need to continue to provide the emotional wellness classes, support programs, evidence-based education, and this podcast, of course, to support those impacted by breast cancer. Because of amazing donors like yourself, last year we've been able to offer over 400 programs serving 6,000 individuals, 57 webinars focused on medical education and information that attracted over 42,000 views, 133 workshops supporting mental health such as expressive writing, art expression, and meditation, and 142 support groups tailored to those living with early-stage breast cancer, metastatic disease, and inflammatory breast cancer. Help us keep our nonprofit, survivingbreastcancer.org, thriving. Join our October 19th fundraising event, Tell Cancer to Go Take a Hike. You can make a donation, sign up, or create a team. Head on over to survivingbreastcancer.org/take a hike to get started. Your support means the world to us and to the people like you that we serve.
Yeah, and exactly what you're saying is that human connection. So it doesn't matter your role, you really do make a difference, whether you are the housekeeper or the physician. And I can't tell you, there were so many times there where I had, a medical technician put her hand on my hand and tell me I was going to be okay, or a nurse saying, I hear you, you're not going to die. Those really things, it's when somebody just acknowledges that we're humans taking care of humans instead of it feeling like as a patient you're a widget going through the process.
I always joke it feels so hard to feel empowered when you're half naked in a Johnny sitting on a cold table. And all of these medical professionals are coming to you with new words you've never heard before, options, and asking for you to make decisions when you haven't had time to explore or research. And they only have a very limited amount of time, right? Like appointments are just back to back to back. And so, how do you manage, time management, giving the patient the time that they deserve and bringing them a part of the conversation and the decision making?
Oh, that's so hard. I remember when I first started my journey and you just lose all sense of dignity. Like I had been married for, almost a decade and, here's, some man seeing my chest that's not my husband. It's super uncomfortable. And then I would also notice that towards the end of the journey, so when I did 30 rounds of radiation and I was on a chair, by now like I don't even feel like these boobs are mine anymore. They've been beaten, battered, and bruised. And so here I am again on the table, oh, this is interesting. So I remember it was like my half, or I'd say 2 months, 3 months into my journey, and I was at my plastic surgeon's office, and a student, that's what it was, like a medical student came in and they're like, oh, well, he's interested in going into healthcare. And so here I am, like brand newly diagnosed, some like I don't know, 16-year-old kid is sitting in here listening to me like almost cry. I'm losing my dignity even more. And so later I found out that was one of the doctor's kids that was there that was kind of interested, but not really, but they just wanted to test it out. Right. Later on down that road, like now I'm in my 30 days of radiation, another kid was there that wanted to go into healthcare and see what it was, but they gave me the option. It was actually my choice this time because the first time it was not. So she said, we have a student here that would like to observe, but we want to give you the authority to recognize that or not. And I said, is it somebody that's really interested in healthcare? Or is it someone's kid that doesn't really know, but just wants to look at this today? And she just kind of looked at me because we had already developed that bond, right? And she goes, it's someone's kid. And I said, absolutely not. Right. So I think there's like this balance too of yes, we have to train people, but at whose expense?
Exactly, exactly. And that's such an interesting point. I have started, not even just with kids, but, doctors saying like, yeah, I have this fellow or someone in training and residency, and they want to look and, be part of this. Now that I'm further out from my diagnosis, I'm 8 years out from my initial diagnosis, I'm actually much more reserved. And I'm like, actually, no, I don't need five fellows looking at my breast and touching and probbing and all of these things. I think when I was diagnosed, I didn't know the difference. I didn't know I had a choice. And, you're just, everyone can see everything, as you were mentioning. But now that I'm further along, I'm like, I've been through a lot, and no, I just want my doctor in the room. Like that's who gets to diagnose me and treat me and make sure I'm on my survivorship plan and all of those things. So the fact that we can say no, for who's in the room is also, our right and empowering.
And the thing is that we don't always teach our patients to speak up, that they are empowered, that are in control. And even as a healthcare executive, like I know the system, I know the ins and outs of it. But yet sometimes I didn't feel empowered if I even wasn't reminded that I had the choice.
So can you tell me, I have no idea what your job is, but I'm so intrigued as a healthcare executive, understanding the ins and outs of operations and the healthcare system. Can you give me like a high level or maybe some examples of some of the systematic processes that you experience that, as your job when you're wearing that hat, this is how it's supposed to work. And then comparing that to what you experienced as a patient?
My last role, I was the chief experience officer. So it was my job to help make sure the consumer experience, patient experience, right? Whatever you want to call the consumer experience should be an entire extension of the system from when the patient becomes aware that they need our services or has a healthcare alarm to how do they feel after they don't aren't in active care but need to maintain in that relationship. And so there's different partners along that journey. Usually, one person in healthcare doesn't own that entire experience. It goes from marketing to your digital person to your patient experience, nursing, physicians, HR. There's a whole bunch of us that are helping to improve those experiences. Usually, as the chief experience officer, you're really helping to look at the data points specifically on voice of the customer, whether that's your surveys or your focus groups, your patient
Mhm.
family advisory councils, et cetera. And then you help work with those other partners to influence human behaviors into more understanding and that communication and connection with patients and process improvement to make the processes better for the staff to be able to deliver a better experience for the patients.
That's great to hear that those conversations are happening at that, like, high level, right? That this is the goal of the patient experience. And I think sometimes in practice, it doesn't always translate that nicely to hear that we have all these people behind the scenes that are really caring about us as patients. One example, again, that we're hearing from some of our community members is, we asked, what's working well in terms of communication? And then what are some of those pain points in terms of communication? And it's interesting. I had a really positive experience where I was treated. I didn't know she was a nurse navigator at the time, but she was my nurse. She was my point person. And she helped coordinate everything from meeting with my surgeon to all of the doctors and the appointments and letting me know that lymphedema could be, a side effect that I developed later on and to connect me also with physical therapists, et cetera. And then I hear from members in our community where that onus is really on the patient to coordinate all of their care. And they don't even know what questions to ask. They wouldn't know that maybe seeing a physical therapist a couple weeks out after surgery, once you're approved to do so, to like really help, mitigate some of the swelling or the cording that could happen or mobility, et cetera. And so, is it the onus of the patient? Is that the responsibility of the surgeon? What, is everyone on the same page, I guess, in terms of moving that care forward? I don't know if that resonates with you and your experience at all.
Oh, 100%. And it actually sounds like you had a better experience than I did, because there was so much miscommunication along my journey. And again, I'm a healthcare executive. I understand a lot of this language. I speak this language. But yet there was things I just didn't understand, and I didn't know what I didn't know. So you're
Exactly.
stuck in this, and I love that you had a nurse navigator, and I was listening to the podcast, earlier about the difference between a patient navigator and nurse navigator. I didn't have those in my care, and that's an amazing resource that that organization gave you. I think it was Honor Health that talked about that because a lot of organizations don't have that. And if they do, it's very, very limited. So let's be honest, like where healthcare is too, like financially to be able to support that for patients, that's going to cost a lot, right? And healthcares don't have that money because they don't get those reimbursements that they need. And we're not going to go into for-profit care or not-profit care, right? That's a whole different podcast, but I got opinions on that too. But it's really hard, right, from a financial perspective. But it's what needs to be done. When I got told what my chemo care was going to be, right? And the doctor called me and I was on the phone and I was in my office. So I was running to another meeting and it said I was going to go through 7 cycles, 3 cycles of adriamycin and 4 cycles of Taxol. And so I'm sitting here thinking, great, 7 cycles, 7 weeks. That's where my brain went. Nobody told me that adriamycin, 1 cycle is 4 weeks. So when I showed up and the girl was going to go start me and do my first adriamycin, and she goes, "Are you going to get a port?" And I said, "No." I'm like, "I have amazing veins. If you can't find a vein on me, I'm going to run. I don't need a port. I don't need one. It's only 7 cycles. I got 7 weeks of this." And she goes, "No, no, no, no." And then she started to explain, and it hit me as she's about to start this chemotherapy that, okay, what I thought was going to be 7 weeks is going to be like 5.5 months.
Yes. Yes, that was my experience as well. Yeah, I was 5.5 months, 6 months. I was also on Adriamycin, and I just remember sitting there, and she printed out, I think from, like, chemocare.com or chemo where you can get all the, like, um,
Mhm.
definitions and then the side effects, and so she literally, like, went to the web and printed things out for me when I'm like, "I thought we weren't supposed to Google things, but that's okay." And she's going through, and so I was like, "Okay, great, 4 cycles, 1 week on, 3 weeks off, 1 week on, etcetera, and you're on this path." And then I was on 12 weeks of Taxol, and that was, like, every week for 12 weeks, and but I'm, like, sitting there and, like, I could not do the math in my head. Just like you were saying, like, if this is supposed to be 7, why am I, like, the 2 on, 1 off? Like, what month are we? Like, I have no idea what's happening. And, yes, then to talk about the port, I don't know in your experience, but everyone also seemed to have an opinion of, "Oh, you don't want the port. You should get the port. Don't get the port." And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, like, hold on. This is my body, my life, my choice." Like, so did you end up getting the port?
Well, it's kind of like breastfeeding as a mom, right? There's so many opinions on it. It's just like, geez.
Yes.
I ended up getting it, but I will tell you, here's another part about communication. I didn't know what a port was. No idea. I thought it was something that was going here, and I didn't even know where, like, what it was going to look like, anything. And of course, I went to Dr. Google. And then the night before, I'm terrified because there's people talking about horror stories of this thing. So I was at an organization that was still under some significant protocols for COVID. And so I got a picture of my husband in that big N95 mask, and I'm in a regular mask as a patient with my hair on. And they were about to bring me back for surgery, and I still didn't know what it was. And they were bringing me all these forms to sign where they're signing my life away. And I'm like, again, excuse me, hello. Nobody's like explained what this was. And they're like, what do you mean? And it was a resident, right? And I was like, somebody needs to explain this to me. Like, what does it look like? Where is it going? Like, how does this even work? And they were just kind of looked at me confused, like, it's not my job, right? Because they're on a timeline. They're like, I need you to sign this paperwork and we're going in. And that was kind of my experience. So when I got out in that very next day, right? When I looked underneath the skin, and it was like purple and neon greenish yellow, I was like, oh my gosh, what just happened? Like, I still didn't really understand. The process to get the port was easy for me. And then while the surgeon let me pick my own music while I was going under, because I was on the twilight music, so I was actually awake for it. It was actually a really great experience then, but before and after, me, not so much.
Getting your port placed is the first step of, like, wow, this is real. This is happening. Like, I have cancer. That's how it felt for me. I got my port placed, I think, in the morning and was in the infusion chair that afternoon getting chemo the same day. And
Oh man.
one, I was like, doesn't that cause infection? I don't know. Like, are you allowed to do that? but that was my experience. And I remember being rolled into the surgery
Yeah.
room for the port placement. And that's when, like, I lost it. I started crying because it was real. It was, like, happening.
Yeah.
My boyfriend at the time, now husband, was like, in the hallway, like, I was like, okay, bye. Like, I guess I'm, like, going now into this process. Um, but it's so interesting too how, like, they give you the Twilight or they give you Ativan or they give you something because you're distraught and nervous. And I just remember the nurse saying, like, "Do you feel better now?" I'm like, "Yes, but this is totally the medicine making me feel better. Like, I don't feel better." But, like, thank you for
You're
calming me
right.
down. Um, so surreal. And
Mhm.
yeah, I'm glad that I did get the port though, because I don't think my veins would have been happy to get the chemotherapy through my veins for that duration. I unfortunately had an infection in my port, and so I needed to actually have it removed and then replaced. But for a short stint of time, I was getting the chemotherapy through my veins, and so I actually do have a webinar on that, actually on YouTube, showing like I looked like I was a heroin addict with like the track marks like on my veins basically, and it did burn. It was very unpleasant. So I'm very glad with my choice. If anyone's listening, of like, do I do a port, not a port? I'm in favor of it. It worked really well for me.
One of the reasons why I didn't get my port was because I asked my doctor, my oncologist about it, and they made a comment about they're like, "Well, that would just be another scar on the body for me as a reminder." And so that kind of like left like a little impression in my mind.
Sure.
And my oncologist was phenomenal. He's like one of those people that is like God just put on the planet just to make better. Like he sparkles, right? Like he's one of those people. And when he made that comment, it wasn't malicious in any type of tent. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
It just wasn't. And but I hung on to it. So
Of
I
course.
think too, as providers, as caregivers in healthcare, we don't realize that our patients hang on to everything we say in ways that it's not always intended.
And my scar is quite significant, especially since it got infected. And
Oh,
so,
yeah.
really interestingly, it not only is it a reminder in like the honor badge, like, oh yes, I went through this, look at my scar, but also a reminder. Um, I'll share, I got married last August, and when I was trying on wedding dresses, I wanted to make sure I had like the halter top style to cross
Mhm.
over to make sure that those scars were not being seen. And
Yeah.
similarly too, like when you're trying on dresses or just in the dressing room, even trying to find bras, you're just like, oh my God, nothing fits properly. Like cancer just sucks. But we found something, it was
Yeah.
beautiful. Everything was great. But to your point, like it is just one more scar on the body. And so, but you ended
Uh-huh.
up getting a port because of the duration, the 5.5 months.
I did, and like I can't imagine having just got the port and then got chemotherapy that day. Like I just bless your heart. Like I can't. I don't. I
Well,
just
well, you
it
don't
was
even
like
know better. Like that's just like, they kind of sign
yeah.
you up and you just go forth.
Well, they didn't even ask me that. Like I ended up doing one in my veins, and then they did the port the next week, and then I did my next treatment because it was like every other week. But I can't even imagine having have had to do it like that.
What other experiences? I'm just so curious too with like your perception of, the healthcare systems and then also that of a patient. Can you share a little bit more about like what you experienced and then how that goes with or against how the systems are set up?
One of the things that's near and dear to my heart, and I swear I'm going to publish an article about this soon. I keep telling myself I need to, but you know, when my oncologist, I saw him one week, and he had said, you still need your PET scan, but right now you're a stage 2B or you're a stage 2, and stage 2 is 100% curable, so, we still need the PET scan, but, that's kind of what I'm thinking. And I'm sitting there like, I'm naturally a positive person. So I'm just like, sweet, this isn't going to be that bad. Woohoo, kind of like did my own little party dance because I'd been super gloomy for the,
Sure.
past 63 days, right? So that next week I came back and it was December 27th, and I'm a huge Christmas buff. Like it is October 6th right now. I've got my Halloween tree up right now. It then turns into a Thanksgiving tree and then a Christmas tree, right? So it's
I
like
love
we got a
that.
Christmas tree up in this house 4 months a year. It's the only way I could sneak it by my husband, but it's a Thanksgiving tree, babe. Like, come
I
on,
like
be
it. I
thankful.
like it.
It was 2 days after Christmas, and I had done my PET scan. Results came back, and so we were sitting there, and he goes, "Stephanie, you're a stage 3B," and I'm like, What? Wait, stage 3 is a little too close to stage 4, right?" And everybody hears the worst things about stage 4, even though there's many beautiful people that are surviving and thriving. Um, she's like, or he's like, "Yeah, you're a stage 3B." And I'm like, "But last week I was stage 2. Like, how do I skip stages?" Right. And he's like, "Well, the game changed." Well, I don't like the game changed. Like, what? So it just kind of threw me for a tailspin. And when I asked one question and I said, "Am I going to make it to next Christmas?" And he said, "I don't know." From then on, I heard nothing. It was a tornado, and I was just spinning, spinning, spinning. and he was talking and touching, and it was just like I just couldn't absorb anything else he had to say, because in just that moment all hope was gone. My best friend and my husband were sitting there in that room, and we're continuing on in the conversation, and thank God that they were there, because I did not hear the hope that he had provided. And so once I started to think about over the next few days what that meant, and my husband and my best friend saying, basically, shut up, you're not going to die. That's not what he said. He said it was highly, 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 highly unlikely, although he can't guarantee life, right? It was like, it was the typical standard response,
But
but
that's not what you
I didn't
heard.
hear it.
That's right.
Exactly. That's not what I heard. So, first my operations mind goes to, how many times are we doing that in healthcare, right? Where we say something that in our minds we're like, oh, it's good, or it's not bad, it's not awful. The patient should act like that, but they do, right? So I had the conversation with my oncologist the next time I had seen him, and because I told him I had wanted to write a book, and so he had said, he goes, think about it from a clinician perspective too. When you go into a room and you have that conversation, like that really impacts you as a human being, whether you're the doctor or not, right? Your emotions are high on too, because you care about your patients. You're wanting to help them, right? And then you leave that room and maybe you have to switch on your brain in a different way and go to the EHR and you have to document something. And then you've got to go to a new patient and have a happy conversation because now there are no evidence of disease, right? And so all day long, you're on this own roller coaster and shifting of your emotions. So think about the moral distress and that how that just affects our clinicians. So when we talk about burnout, like how is that contributing to burnout in healthcare?
So many great points, and it goes back to your topic earlier of how we hang on to every word that our doctor says, and hanging on to shut off because I'm just still stuck on what you just told me, but how the information was communicated and delivered. So I would love to just go deeper into some of that. That's such a great segue into, how do we have these conversations? Because I'm hearing your story, and part of me is like, oh, this is actually really positive. The doctor is not he's not sugarcoating this situation. He's being honest and transparent and is giving me, the realistic expectation, right? Which I also hear that just tell me how it is. But then, if I'm not ready for that information, how do we bridge that gap where it's like, have a prelim conversation of like, how do you want information to be received? Or, hi, my name is Laura, and this is how I work with my patients, and this is how I deliver information. Does that work for you? Or what is your expectation of when I come in and give you the results? Would you like me to bring all of my studies and my research, or would you know, I don't know. Like, is there a way where we can actually find a middle ground? Because to your point, I think it's not a matter of like wrong or right, or he said this or she said this, or you're hearing the information, you're internalizing it differently than I intended. But like, how do we find that? Like, I don't expect all of us to have the answer, but I'm just like throwing it out there theoretically. Like, I think there's a lot of ways we could receive information, and how do we, you know, train our medical professionals with what you just said, where you have this like highs and lows and ups and downs, where you're just back to back with emotions as well. Um, it's not easy. There's no easy answer. I'm just posing the question.
Yeah. We do train. We do train everyone in healthcare lots of times, and I kind of call it, sometimes we spray everybody with education and we pray that it sticks. Like you just can't give everybody education, because that's not always the problem. Someone great, I don't remember who, but somebody had said healthcare was never originally designed. And now it's really hard to change. It's like a bus, and it's really hard to change the wheels on the bus when the bus is moving. And so I think too, it's like when you're providing all this education to your physicians and your nurses and, all your clinical support teams, and it's like, they get that education, but how are we helping to improve the processes for our clinicians so that they can have those longer conversations, right? We don't have everybody always working to the top of their licenses. And so we put a new practice into place. And although it looks like it's going to help solve all these other problems, it then messes up all the system on the back end for these other things. And so it's like we constantly put band-aids on things instead of getting to really the root cause of the analysis. So when we talk about how do we fix communication in healthcare, there's certainly no one easy fix. But what comes to mind is starting to do other solutions that could help our care teams provide more efficient care and have information more readily available. The EHR, mostly everybody's got one. I think you have to have one in the United States, right? So, but it's like, how are they utilizing it to the best ability? So, I think about an EHR field at the very beginning, right? When a patient comes in, like, how do you best handle information? Do you want it written on paper? Do you want somebody to call you? Different demographics, different generations are going to want things differently, right? So, I think that that's the one thing. The hard piece with that is that there are so many screens and templates for our clinicians to utilize that unless there becomes somewhere that it's like you're programmed to, okay, well, I got to look here before I do this, right? Because otherwise it's like you have all this information, but you don't know where to use it because it's not readily available. I was just talking to a scheduler the other day about it. She's like, well, I don't see that information because I got to go through 8 different templates to get it. Well, why isn't somebody fixing the EHR to do that for them then, right? So then it saves time, because if it saves your scheduler, 30 seconds here and they talk to 100 patients a day, like how much time is that? So it's like, it's just process improvement around that. And then I think there's two other things. I think the next part. So is the process of when people are getting that information, who do we require to be with them? Sometimes patients just come in by themselves, and that should be like oh no, right? Like, who else can be there with you? Who's going to remember the hope that we are providing, right? And I think the third part of that one is so it was like day 3 after I had that conversation with my doctor, and my best friend and my husband kept reminding me that I'm not going to die. It would have been really nice to have had that nurse navigator or that access to my physician again for a 15-minute call to say, hey, I know 48 hours ago we had a really difficult conversation. I want to remind you, blah, blah, blah. What questions do you have for me? Right now, from operations perspective, I'm like, okay, but that's going to add to the cost, right? Especially if you're paying your provider now 15 minutes, that's going to decrease access for everybody else. So there's all these things that end up happening if we choose to do something like that. So it's like you don't know really what the right solution is, but I will tell you, healthcare is amazing. And we get creative with the resources that we have. So I would challenge people to look at those areas of opportunities of where those patients are feeling that and start to develop more solutions than just spraying everybody with education and praying that it sticks.
Thank you for taking the time to answer the very complex question with really concrete examples. It's so helpful. And that's, shameless plug for survivingbreastcancer.org, but that's, I think, really where we see us as a nonprofit organization to be able to partner with the hospitals and the nurse navigators, because we understand time and resources are, everyone already has a huge caseload, right? Like there is no like bandwidth to like take on more, as you were saying as well, as much as we want to do that. But how can we then outsource that to organizations like survivingbreastcancer.org, where we would be able to then maybe follow up with those newly diagnosed, connect with them from a peer-to-peer perspective or through a patient navigation perspective of, okay, we understand that you just got recently diagnosed. Let me share some resources that we can offer for you 100% free, whether it's a support group, expressive writing, art therapy classes, but then also just talking to other people who have been diagnosed. Because for me, that was the biggest piece missing in my journey of I was newly diagnosed and I wanted to find someone 5 years out on the other side post-treatment to give me hope. And I could not find that person being in Massachusetts with all the amazing hospitals that we had. It was so siloed that I had to turn to social media actually. Um, to be able to find people who were diagnosed because again with HIPAA laws and everything, like no one could share that with me. And so I'm like, how do I find this community and how do I find people who get it and who have gone through with it? And you mentioned, you were diagnosed and you have young kids. Like, how do you navigate this as a mom? And so just being able to find people that I think us as a nonprofit are able to actually provide those outlets for people and can really partner with hospitals in that complementary, well-rounded care of the whole person.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely phenomenal. The first health system that I was at, the only support I got was a social worker who basically called and did a screen to look at my mental state, right? And then at the end, it was like, well, what resources do you want? And it's like, well, what do you have? Like, I've never been a cancer patient before. I don't know, right? And then there was never more of that offering because I think too, at the very beginning, you're so overwhelmed with everything that is going on that it's like you just can't be bothered with another thing. I was literally talking about this yesterday with my husband. And it's just like these are great resources. Now shift to where I'm the health system I'm at right now. They offer all those resources, right? Like day one, but I was also now a year and a half through my journey. So I was like more open to, oh, I can do that, right? And I was more open to figuring it out on my own because nobody's walking you through it, right? They give you like a piece of paper and they say, hey, here's all the resources we have, which is great. It was more than I got last time. But again, you don't have that hand holding. And I think sometimes when you get a life threatening disease and you're going through it and you've got all this other things on your plate outside of your disease, you are so overwhelmed that you need someone to hold your hand or remind you or those little nudges, It's like when your mom stands behind you and pokes you in the back, right? It's like you
Yes,
need you
yes.
need
Do
this
your
little
homework, do
nudge.
your homework. Drink your milk.
Exactly.
Yes. No, and I agree too. Even like I got a binder of resources, but who has the time to sort through the binder of information? So even saying, here's the binder of information that you can go through when you have time, when you're feeling up to it, but here are like the top 3 that I recommend. Like as you were mentioning, hanging on to those words. Like if it's coming from our nurse or our oncologist or our surgeon, like I'm going to take that home and then probably take action because it was recommended by somebody.
I talk about all this, and I recently published a book called Buried or Planted, right? And so in this book, I call out healthcare leaders at the end of most sections to say, here's the friction that I experienced. Sometimes I have the answer, sometimes I don't. I'm like, this is way above like my how my brain works. So how else can we figure it out? And I when I went through my journey, my motto became survive, thrive, make a difference. And it really helped motivate me on those days where I felt like I just couldn't. And so my book is a gift to that, to say, hey, healthcare, this is how breast cancer feels, right? And that this isn't the only service line that this is happening in, guaranteed. So, how do we fix it?
And do you find that these conversations are happening at that level, like when you're attending conferences or kind of figuring out with the medical professionals? And it's not just them. I think there's like the patient experience, which I know you're focused on, the healthcare systems and the operations, but there's also like the insurers and other people too that kind of play into this whole complex ecosystem, if you will. Are we starting to see these conversations happening? And to move the needle, we definitely have to move in small little increments. It doesn't happen overnight. But is there hope? Are you finding that people are resonating with some of these recommendations, first off, acknowledging the friction and then starting to have those conversations about how to fix it?
Yes and no. Kind of a complicated answer. There are some amazing individuals across this country that are dedicating their lives to this, right? The experience type roles, a lot of them are getting more and more eliminated across the country just due to the financial state of where healthcare is today. But people all throughout, and you don't have to have a title, right, to help do process improvement and experience. But this experience whole in nature, it's being constantly talked about. However, the reality is that hospitals have to operate as efficiently as possible in order to create a margin. If there's no margin, there's no mission, right? So it comes back to this that unfortunately, patient experience, as much as we'd love to say, and our mission statements say that we have to, right? That we are totally patient centric and we're going to do this, we have to operation officially. And so it doesn't always happen. And there was an article released by the Barrel Institute like 6 months ago or so, but they talk about the role of like the human experience officer and how when we talk about process improvement and patient experience, employee experience in healthcare, that it's so siloed. There's so many different officers that those things report through. And it's like, well, why can't we just have one, right? Why couldn't one person be ultimately in charge of all this, right? And there's pros and cons to both. So there's no right, wrong. It's just we've got to get better. There's just no other way. We have to get better at it.
So tell us the name of your book again and where our listeners can find it. How do they get it?
The book is called Buried or Planted: 100 plus experts' insights from a healthcare executive's journey as a cancer patient. And it is available on Amazon.
Awesome. We'll definitely link to that in the show notes to associate that with this podcast so people can find out more. I know I want to pick it up and read more because I feel like you have a wealth of knowledge living in your brain that you put into text. And so I know we're just scratching the surface on some of these communication plans to really strengthen the dialogue between the patient and the doctors and the nurses. I would love to end just because we asked so many of our community members to weigh in on today's conversation about communication. If I could just read a couple quotes from our community members, the challenges that they face with communication, but then I want to leave our listeners with the hope and the positives, because as you mentioned, Stephanie S., full name right there. I don't know if you just go by Stephanie S. or Steph, but to leave with this hope that there is so much good out there, and for every challenge that we have, there's going to be someone out there who is doing such great, excellent work. I think as we started off earlier today, we just got diagnosed with breast cancer. It is so overwhelming. You referenced, this tornado and this whirlwind of information. As we're focused on communication between our healthcare medical team and our doctors and that of the patient, I want to read to you some comments we got from our survivingbreastcancer.org community. And here's what they have to say. While treatment is over, go live your life. Everything is different now, and no one is telling me what I need to do next. I'm dealing with neuropathy, aches, pains, and chemo brain. Another community member mentions, I need more guidance post-op. Everything that can go wrong in photos at the first consultation did not help me. So again, yes, we want to talk about all of the risks of what we're about to go through, but maybe not necessarily leading with all of the risks.
Yes.
Hearing from our doctors, our plastic surgeons, and our surgeons that our breasts look great because they were looking for validation in their surgical work, even though I felt that my breasts did not look great. Wanting to feel and be heard. I had a doctor tell me it was all in my head and I did not have breast cancer. So these, again, I know, when you have symptoms or you have pain or you have these things, it is all in your head. I'm sharing this because this is happening to me. I need to be heard and acknowledged. And I think that's really where those relationships with the nurses can help us advocate. But some of the positives, because like I said, people are also having great experiences. So one of our members said, my oncologist was the first person who made me feel like I was going to be all right. She was the first doctor during that time to make me feel like she cared about me as a person. So again, Stephanie, everything that you were saying as well. My oncologist was brilliant. At my first visit, he put his number into my cell phone. Another person said, she kept me calm and asked if I wanted her to pray with me and my husband before my surgery. How powerful.
Yeah.
And let's see, my breast cancer nurse, she helped me with all of my appointments, talked through my doubts, and even went to my surgery and post-surgery to visit me. My nurse made me feel human. And as I started to, this woman mentioned, the radiation receptionist told me for 30 days, good morning, gorgeous, as I walked in. So, to end with a smile, I would love to hear from our listeners too, if this episode resonated with you. If you have any questions, we can always follow up with Stephanie. I hope you go get her book. But if you have comments or questions about communication with your healthcare providers, we would love to hear from you. There's also a link in the show notes to provide fan mail. So thank you, Stephanie, for taking the time. Is there anything else it's a short time for our podcast, but is there anything else that we didn't cover today that you definitely wanted to make sure our listeners received?
I just want to say survive, thrive, and make a difference.
Amazing. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for listening to our show. I would like to acknowledge that all of the information on our podcast is from personal experiences and is not a substitute for professional medical advice. You should always contact your medical care team. If you are looking for specific topics or would like to be a guest on our show, please feel free to reach out. My email is laura@survivingbreastcancer.org. Our show is made possible by our nonprofit, survivingbreastcancer.org, and by our incredible donors like yourself. You can hop on over to survivingbreastcancer.org to sign up for our mailing list, make a donation, and explore the 400 plus programs we offer each year, at survivingbreastcancer.org/events. Until next time, keep on thriving.